Chapter 1. Origins in St. Paul, 1891 to 1909. Adelard Leo Cunin entered the world on August 21st in St. Paul, Minnesota, the year disputed in the historical record. Some sources list 1891, others 1893. What is not disputed is where he came from and the household that shaped him. His father, Jules Cunin, was a French immigrant from Alsace-Lorraine, a skilled mason whose work was in steady demand. His mother, Marie-Diana Gobeil, came from Chicoutimi in Quebec. They settled in the French section of St. Paul, raised their children in the Catholic faith, and expected discipline, obedience, and structure. Inside that home, Adelard did not fit easily. Jules Cunin was hard-tempered and strict, and the relationship between father and son was openly hostile. Adelard clashed with authority early and often, whether it came from his father or from religious institutions. He attended Catholic schools in St. Paul, including Cretin High School, but he struggled under the rule of priests and brothers. Years later, he would recall that period with bitterness, once muttering "maudits frères," cursed brothers, a phrase that followed him through adulthood. His mother remained a steady presence, devoted to him even as he drifted further from the life she hoped he would live. By 1906, when he was about 15 years old, Adelard was already working, employed by the Stern Tailoring Company, while still living with his parents at 105 South Wabasha Street. The routine did not last. He showed a volatile temper, an inability to settle, and a growing resentment toward control of any kind. School fell away first, then came the streets. By his late teens, Adelard Cunin was edging toward the margins, pulled less by ambition than by restlessness and anger, traits that would soon define the man the world would come to know as George Bugs Moran. Chapter 2. First Crimes and the Birth of George Moran, 1910 to 1918. By around 1910, Adelard Cunin could no longer stay in St. Paul. He ran from his family and from the structure that had boxed him in since childhood, drifting south to Chicago. The city was loud, crowded, and indifferent, which suited him. He fell in with other young street criminals and quickly found his place among them. Their work was crude but effective. They looted warehouses along the Chicago River and took part in a horse-snatching racket, stealing animals and demanding ransom money from their owners. It was not sophisticated crime, but it paid, and more importantly, it gave Cunin a sense of belonging he had never found at home. In 1912, the run ended. Cunin and his associates were arrested, and when police demanded his name, he hesitated only briefly. He answered with the first name that came to mind: George Moran. It was not an alias carefully constructed to deceive, but it became permanent the moment it was written into official records. From that arrest forward, Adelard Leo Cunin effectively disappeared on paper. George Moran took his place. That first arrest opened the door to a cycle that would define his early adulthood. Jail terms followed one after another for burglary, larceny, and related thefts. He learned quickly how the system worked, how to keep his real identity buried, and how to survive inside institutions he already despised. By the time he approached his early 20s, Moran had been incarcerated multiple times, building a reputation as volatile, angry, and unreliable. The streets were hardening him, and the name George Moran was beginning to carry weight, not as a myth yet, but as a man authorities already knew they would be seeing again. Chapter 3. Prison, Violence, and Criminal Apprenticeship, 1918 to 1923. By 1918, George Moran was no longer cycling in and out of short jail terms. A robbery conviction finally landed him with a serious sentence. The judge handed down a term of 1 to 14 years, sending Moran into the Illinois prison system at a time when it was crowded with professional criminals, not petty thieves. For Moran, prison did not correct behavior, it refined it. Behind bars, he learned how crime actually worked, who could be trusted, and who could not. He also began forming relationships that would matter long after his release, including a close bond with Tommy, the Terrible Towhee, a fellow inmate whose reputation for violence was already well known. Around this period, Moran survived a knife fight that nearly killed him. The incident erupted during an outdoor speech when Moran confronted a heckler who would not stop interrupting the speaker. The argument escalated fast. Steel came out. Moran was slashed across the neck and chest, suffering wounds so severe that he spent weeks in the hospital. The scars never left him. For the rest of his life, he favored buttoned-up collars to hide the damage. Newspapermen later attached the nickname Bugs to him, partly for color, partly because of his unpredictable temper. The name stuck, reinforcing an image of a man who could explode without warning. Prison hardened Moran, but it also elevated his standing. He proved he could endure confinement, violence, and isolation without breaking. He kept his real identity buried and his mouth shut. On February 1st, 1923, Moran was paroled, helped along by connections willing to grease the right palms. When he walked back into Chicago, he was no longer a drifting street criminal. He was a man with scars, contacts, and credibility. The underworld noticed. The North Side noticed. And George Bugs Moran was finally positioned to move from the margins into organized crime. Chapter 4. Entry into the North Side Gang, 1923 to 1924. When George Bugs Moran walked out of prison in early 1923, Chicago was changing fast. Prohibition had turned alcohol into currency, and gangs were no longer loose crews of thieves. They were organizations. Moran stepped into that moment with the right scars, the right prison contacts, and a reputation for being fearless when violence was required. Through men he had met inside and around the North Side, Moran was brought into the orbit of Dean O'Banion, the florist-turned-gang leader who was quietly building one of the most powerful bootlegging operations in the city. O'Banion was not impressed by talk. He watched how men carried themselves, how they handled pressure, and whether they could be trusted to stay loyal. Moran passed those tests. He began frequenting McGovern's Cabaret at 666 North Clark Street, a known gathering place for North Side criminals. It was there that Moran moved from being a hanger-on to becoming part of the inner circle. He ran with safecrackers, armed enforcers, and liquor men, learning how territory was divided and defended. Prohibition money was flowing in, and Moran was now positioned to take his share. By 1924, Moran was working closely alongside Jaime Weiss and Vincent Drucci, both violent and ambitious figures within the North Side Gang. Together, they enforced bootlegging routes, protected breweries, and pushed back against rival outfits that tried to encroach on their territory. The gang was largely Irish and Catholic, and that identity mattered. It shaped loyalties and sharpened resentments, especially toward Italian gangs on the South Side. Moran fit naturally into that world. He did not drink heavily, did not involve himself in prostitution, and viewed the business as war rather than indulgence. For the first time in his life, Moran had structure, money, and purpose. Dean O'Banion was the boss, but Moran was becoming one of the men O'Banion relied on when force was required. He was no longer a runaway or a small-time thief. He was a North Sider now, fully committed, armed, and standing at the edge of a conflict that was about to consume the city. Chapter 5. The O'Banion Murder and Gang War Ignition, 1924 to 1925. On the morning of November 10th, 1924, the North Side Gang lost its center of gravity. Dean O'Banion was standing inside his flower shop on North State Street, a place that doubled as his headquarters, when three men walked in under the pretense of buying flowers for the funeral of Mike Merlo. One of them was Frank Yale, a gunman tied to New York and allied with the Torrio Capone organization. The others were connected to the South Side. When O'Banion reached out to shake Yale's hand, the guns came out. He was shot repeatedly at close range and died where he stood, surrounded by the flowers he sold for a living. George Moran was not present for the killing, but the impact on him was immediate and permanent. O'Banion had been his boss, his mentor, and the man who had given him a place in Chicago's bootlegging hierarchy. The murder was not random. It was retaliation. O'Banion had engineered a police raid on Seaban's brewery shortly after selling it to Johnny Torrio. Knowing a second prohibition conviction would send Torrio to prison, Torrio survived the legal fallout. O'Banion did not survive the response. Leadership of the Northside gang shifted quickly. Earl Jaime Weiss stepped in, with Moran and Vincent Drucci forming the core of the enforcement arm. They did not wait long to strike back. Torrio became their primary target. In 1925, after weeks of stalking and surveillance, Weiss and Moran caught Torrio outside his apartment at 7016 South Clyde Avenue as he returned home with his wife. Drucci waited behind the wheel as lookout. Moran and Weiss opened fire with a shotgun and a .45 automatic. Torrio was hit multiple times, his chauffeur wounded, his car riddled with bullets. The attack nearly succeeded. Torrio was left bleeding heavily from wounds to his jaw, lung, and abdomen. At one point, Moran pressed his pistol to Torrio's head, but the gun clicked empty. Drucci sounded the horn, signaling it was time to flee. Torrio lived, barely. From his hospital bed, shaken and broken by how close he had come to death, he would soon hand control of the Chicago outfit to Al Capone and retreat from the street war he no longer had the stomach to fight. For Moran, there was no retreat. The O'Banion murder had locked him into a path where violence was no longer a tool, but a constant condition. The gang war was fully ignited now, and George Bugs Moran was no longer an enforcer acting on orders. He was becoming one of the men driving the conflict step by step towards something far bloodier than anyone in Chicago had seen before. Chapter 6. Leadership Shifts and Escalating Violence, 1926 to 1927. By 1926, the Northside gang was operating in a state of constant retaliation. The attempt on Johnny Torrio had changed the balance of power, but it had not ended the war. Al Capone now controlled the South Side, and he brought a scale of violence and organization that Chicago had not seen before. The Northsiders answered in kind, and at the center of that effort was Jaime Weiss, with George Moran and Vincent Drucci acting as his primary lieutenants. Weiss believed pressure and persistence would eventually break Capone's hold on the city. That belief cost him his life. In October 1926, Jaime Weiss was gunned down outside O'Banion's old flower shop, the same location where the war had begun 2 years earlier. Capone's men ambushed him in broad daylight, cutting him down with shotgun fire. Weiss died from his wounds, and with him went the last buffer between Moran and full leadership. The loss hit the North Side hard. Weiss had been aggressive, visible, and relentless. His death removed the gang's strategist and left a vacuum that could not remain open for long. Vincent Drucci stepped up briefly, but his time was short. In April 1927, Drucci was shot and killed by Chicago detective Dan Healy during what authorities claimed was an attempted arrest. With Drucci dead and Weiss gone, there was no ambiguity left inside the organization. George Bugs Moran became the undisputed leader of the Northside gang. He had not sought the position through politics or speeches. It came to him through survival. Under Moran's control, the conflict with Capone intensified. Shootings, ambushes, and bombings continued as both sides fought for territory, breweries, and distribution routes. Bodies accumulated, and the city grew accustomed to the sound of gunfire as background noise. Moran was no showman. He avoided publicity when he could, delegated violence carefully, and focused on holding the North Side together under constant pressure. Capone wanted dominance. Moran wanted resistance. By the end of 1927, the Chicago underworld was split cleanly along territorial lines, with Moran and Capone locked in a war that neither side seemed willing or able to end. Leadership had settled, but peace was nowhere in sight. The violence was no longer personal. It was structural, and George Moran was now standing at the top of a shrinking but defiant organization, facing an enemy who intended to finish what Torrio had started. Chapter 7. Power, Profits, and Pressure, 1927 to 1928. By late 1927, George Bugs Moran was holding together what many believed should have already collapsed. With Weiss and Drucci gone, Capone expected the North Side to fold. It did not. Moran tightened his grip and diversified. Bootlegging remained the backbone, but it was no longer enough on its own. Moran expanded aggressively into gambling, labor rackets, and legitimate fronts that could move money quietly. He made inroads with unions, understanding that control of workers meant leverage that guns alone could not provide. One of his most profitable moves came through the dry cleaning and dyeing industry. Alongside his trusted associate Leo Mongovan, Moran protected Northside cleaners from Southside intimidation and cut Capone out of a steady revenue stream. He also pushed into dog racing, backing the Fairview Kennel Track, which operated in direct competition with Capone's Hawthorne Track. Federal raids followed and pressure mounted, but the profits were real enough to keep Moran solvent and dangerous. Moran lived under constant threat. Attempts were made on his life, and on Mongovan's, more than once. Still, Moran refused to disappear. He mocked Capone openly, calling the Lexington Hotel and blowing raspberries into the phone when Capone answered. In public, he taunted him just as openly, knowing it infuriated a man who demanded fear and respect. It was reckless behavior on the surface, but it served a purpose. Moran wanted Capone to know the North Side was still alive. Beyond Chicago, Moran maintained close ties to Danny Hogan, the Irish mob boss who dominated organized crime in St. Paul. The friendship ran deep. When Hogan was murdered by car bomb on December 4, 1928, Moran traveled north and personally stood guard outside the Hogan family home on West 7th Street. It was not for show. It was a message to anyone watching that Moran still had reach, loyalty, and allies beyond city limits. But the pressure was becoming relentless. Capone wanted the North Side eliminated, not weakened. Moran's refusal to back down, his interference with profits, and his continued control of territory made him the final obstacle to total dominance. By the end of 1928, the violence had not slowed. It had focused, and George Moran was standing at the center of it, unaware that plans were already in motion to end the war in a single, decisive act. Chapter 8. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, February 14th, 1929. February 14th, 1929 began like a routine business morning for the North Side gang. A liquor deal had been arranged, a truckload of Canadian whiskey offered at a bargain price. The delivery was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. at the SMC Cartage Garage at 2122 North Clark Street, a place Moran used to store bootlegging trucks. It was the kind of transaction Moran had overseen countless times before, but this one had already been compromised. 7 men gathered inside the garage. They were Moran's core people, trusted operators who handled enforcement, logistics, and money. Among them was Albert Weinshank, a man who bore a strong resemblance to Moran himself. 2 others present were not gang members at all. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., a police car pulled up outside. 4 men entered the building, 2 dressed as Chicago police officers, 2 in plain clothes. The men inside did not resist. Police raids were common, and compliance often meant survival. The supposed officers ordered everyone to line up against the wall. Moments later, the shooting started. Shotguns and machine guns tore through the line at close range. When it was over, 6 men lay dead, and one, Frank Gussenberg, was still breathing but mortally wounded. He was taken to the hospital, where he lived just long enough to refuse cooperation. Asked who shot him, Gussenberg answered, "No one shot me," and died soon after. George Moran was supposed to be there. He was the intended target. That morning, he was running late. As he approached the garage, he saw the police car outside. Sensing a raid, Moran turned around and walked into a nearby cafe instead. Inside the garage, one of the lookouts mistook Albert Weinshank for Moran and gave the signal to begin the attack. That mistake spared Moran's life. Witnesses later saw the 2 police officers escort the other gunman out of the building, reinforcing the illusion of a legitimate arrest and delaying the police response. By the time real officers arrived, the damage was irreversible. No one was ever convicted. Al Capone was in Florida that day and denied involvement, though Moran publicly broke the underworld's code of silence and blamed Capone outright. The scale and precision of the killings left little doubt in the public mind who had ordered it. The massacre destroyed the North Side gang in a single morning. Moran survived, but his organization did not. The balance of power in Chicago shifted permanently. The war that had consumed the city through the 1920s ended not with a truce, but with bodies on a concrete floor. George "Bugs" Moran walked away alive, but from that moment on, everything he had built began to slip out of his hands. Chapter 9. Aftermath and Decline of the North Side, 1929 to 1930. In the days after the massacre, George Moran did not return to the streets. He ended up in a hospital, suffering from exhaustion and shock. The men who had been killed were not distant associates. They were his core. The loss hollowed out the North Side overnight. Moran was alive, but the structure he commanded had been shattered in a way gunfire alone could not explain. Informants circled, police pressure increased, and former allies began calculating their own survival. The most damaging blow came from within. Ted Newbury, once a trusted North Side gunman and Moran bodyguard, quietly defected to the Capone organization. Newbury offered information, routes, and operational knowledge in exchange for power. Capone accepted. After the massacre, Newbury was positioned to take control of what remained of North Side operations under South Side authority. Moran's grip weakened quickly as fear replaced loyalty. Men who had survived the war now wanted distance from it. Moran did not surrender. He moved cautiously, aware that Chicago had become hostile ground. He attempted to counterbalance Capone by forming alliances that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Joe Aiello, a longtime Capone rival, became one such partner. Jack Zuter, whom Moran personally disliked, became another. These were not friendships. They were transactions born of desperation. Moran understood he no longer had the manpower to stand alone. At the same time, he began looking west. Moran approved efforts to establish operations in California, sending trusted men to Los Angeles to set up criminal footholds away from Capone's reach. Several of those men were later arrested by police, some connected to high-profile crimes including the killing of reporter Jake Lingle. The expansion showed that Moran was still thinking strategically, but the execution lacked the cohesion he once commanded. By 1930, the North Side gang no longer functioned as a unified force. Federal raids shut down ventures like the Fairview Kennel dog track, which was later destroyed by fire. Moran himself was arrested repeatedly on vagrancy and weapons charges, dragged into courtrooms where his name still carried weight but no longer fear. The war had ended, and Moran had survived it. What followed was something quieter and more punishing. Decline didn't come with gunfire. It came with isolation, betrayal, and the slow realization that Chicago had already moved on without him. Chapter 10. Legal Trouble and Public Enemy Status, 1930 to 1939. By 1930, George "Bugs" Moran was no longer fighting a gang war. He was fighting gravity. Chicago police, federal agents, and prosecutors saw him as a remnant of an older era, but they were not willing to let him fade quietly. Moran was arrested again and again on vagrancy charges, weapons violations, and suspicion tied to robberies. Courtrooms replaced speakeasies, mugshots replaced territory maps. Each arrest chipped away at whatever authority he still carried. Law enforcement also tried to remove him permanently by attacking his identity. Moran was repeatedly detained while authorities attempted to deport him, mistakenly believing he was Polish, Bohemian, or Canadian. The irony was that Moran had been born in the United States in St. Paul, Minnesota. Each attempt failed, but the process kept him tied up in custody and under constant surveillance. Judges who despised gangsters nonetheless recognized Moran as a familiar figure, a man who had outlasted most of his contemporaries. As prohibition wound down, Moran drifted. He moved from state to state, surviving on robberies, counterfeiting, and financial fraud. The crimes were smaller than his old bootlegging empire, but they carried real prison time. In 1938 and 1939, federal authorities finally closed in on him for good. Moran was charged with conspiracy to cash approximately $62,000. in forged American Express travelers' checks. The case stuck. In 1939, Moran was convicted and sentenced to prison. He managed a brief release on bond while his appeal was pending, then disappeared. It didn't last long. He was captured again and returned to custody, the pattern repeating itself with increasing finality. By the end of the decade, Moran was broke, aging, and isolated. The man once labeled public enemy material was no longer feared. He was processed. The legal system that had failed to stop him during the gang wars was now closing in slowly, methodically, and with no intention of letting him walk away again. Chapter 11. A life reduced to small crimes, 1940 to 1956. By the early 1940s, George Bugs Moran was no longer a power broker. He was a drifter with a criminal record that followed him everywhere. The bootlegging money was gone. The alliances were gone. What remained was a man moving from city to city across the Midwest, surviving on whatever crimes he could still pull off. Robberies replaced rackets. Counterfeiting and forged checks replaced control of territory. It was crime stripped of status, driven by necessity rather than ambition. Moran served multiple prison sentences during this period, often for offenses that would have been handled quietly years earlier. Each stretch inside took more from him. His health declined, his reputation faded. The younger criminals who passed him in holding cells knew his name, but they did not fear it. They saw him as a relic from the Chicago gang wars, a man who had outlived his era. Even so, Moran carried himself with discipline, avoided trouble inside when possible, and worked alongside other inmates, including mentally ill prisoners, earning a measure of respect in confinement that he no longer commanded on the street. His personal life collapsed alongside his criminal one. His second wife eventually left him while he was incarcerated, severing one of the last connections he had to life outside prison walls. When Moran was finally paroled in 1956, he walked out with no money, no family, and nowhere to go. Freedom lasted only briefly. Authorities were waiting. Almost immediately, Moran was arrested again, this time for his role in a 1945 bank robbery in Ansonia, Ohio, a charge that had been held in reserve while he served earlier sentences. The pattern was complete. Every time Moran surfaced, the past pulled him back under. He had survived Capone, Prohibition, and the bloodiest years of Chicago's underworld. What he could not escape was the accumulation of smaller crimes that finally caught up to him. By the mid-1950s, George Moran was no longer running from rivals. He was running out of time. Chapter 12. Final Sentence and Death at Leavenworth, 1957. By January 1957, there were no delays left, no appeals that mattered, and no favors to be called in. George Bugs Moran was found guilty for his role in the 1945 bank robbery in Ansonia, Ohio, a crime that had followed him quietly for more than a decade. The court sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison. At 65 years old, Moran understood what the sentence really meant. This was not a term he was expected to finish on his feet. He was sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, the same prison that had housed many of the men he once fought or outlived. Inside, Moran kept his head down. The younger inmates treated him with a kind of wary respect, not because of who he was anymore, but because of what he had survived. Capone was gone. Most of the old Chicago figures were dead. Moran was one of the last still breathing. He worked quietly, including assignments involving mentally ill prisoners, and caused no trouble. His health deteriorated rapidly. Years of hard living and heavy smoking caught up with him. Moran began losing weight and suspected the truth before doctors confirmed it. Lung cancer had advanced beyond treatment. In an eerie coincidence that did not go unnoticed by prison staff, Moran received the sacraments of penance and extreme unction on February 14, 1957, exactly 28 years after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that had ended his world and spared his life. George Moran died at Leavenworth on February 25, 1957. He was 63 years old. There was no funeral procession, no public reckoning. He was buried on prison grounds 2 days later. His possessions were few and unremarkable: 2 pairs of glasses, 2 bars of soap, a razor and a case, 4 packs of razor blades, 1 legal paper. That was all that remained of a man who once stood at the center of Chicago's most violent era. In the end, Moran did not die in a shootout or a headline-grabbing execution. He died quietly, contained by the same system that had chased him for decades. The gang wars faded into history, Capone into legend, and Bugs Moran into a footnote shaped less by myth than by endurance. He outlived his enemies, but he did not outlive the consequences.